Racist professor says, "Your kind don't do math." Then the black girl solves a problem that NASA couldn't. When Professor Whitman sneered, "Your kind don't do math," 17-year-old Angela Buck had no idea her scribbled solution would expose NASA's billion-dollar mistake and change everything forever. The chalk dust hung in the air like suspended judgment as Professor Harold Whitman surveyed his classroom with the calculating gaze of a predator. At 62, he commanded respect through fear, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tailored suit armor of academic authority. For 35 years, he had been MIT's most feared mathematics professor, and he wore that reputation like a badge of honor. "Mathematics," he announced, his voice cutting through the morning silence, "is not democratic. It doesn't care about your feelings, your background, or your excuses. It simply is. And some people," his eyes swept across the diverse faces before him, lingering deliberately on certain students, "are simply not equipped to handle its demands. My beautiful family, let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now let us begin." 17-year-old Angela Buck sat in the third row, her notebook already filled with calculations that went far beyond the day's assignment. A child prodigy who had skipped 3 grades, she was the youngest student in MIT's history to be accepted into their advanced mathematics program. Her dark skin seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent lights, and her natural hair was pulled back in a simple bun, revealing eyes that sparkled with an intelligence that made professors twice her age uncomfortable. She had learned long ago to make herself small in spaces like this, to speak only when spoken to prove herself twice as hard for half the recognition. But mathematics, pure, beautiful mathematics, had always been her sanctuary. Numbers didn't see color. Equations didn't care about zip codes or family income. In the world of mathematical proof, truth was truth. "Miss Buck," Professor Whitman's voice sliced through her thoughts like ice. "Since you seem so absorbed in your scribbling, perhaps you'd like to solve the problem on the board." Angela looked up to see a complex differential equation sprawled across the blackboard, something about orbital mechanics and gravitational fields. It was challenging, certainly, but not impossible. She could see the solution forming in her mind already. "Yes, sir," she said, rising from her seat. "Oh, wait." Professor Whitman held up a hand, his lips curving into what might generously be called a smile. "Before you embarrass yourself, let me save you some time. This is a problem that NASA's top mathematicians have been working on for months. It involves calculations that require not just intelligence, but the kind of abstract thinking that comes from certain backgrounds. Cultural advantages, if you will." The classroom fell deadly silent. 23 pairs of eyes turned to watch this verbal execution. Professor Whitman leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "Your kind don't do math, Miss Buck. Oh, you might memorize formulas, follow procedures, but real mathematical innovation? That requires a different sort of mind altogether." The words hit Angela like physical blows. "Your kind." The phrase echoed in the sudden silence, loaded with centuries of assumptions and prejudice. She felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest, but something else rose with it, a cold, calculating fury that sharpened her mind like a blade. "With respect, Professor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I think you're wrong." "Excuse me?" "I said I think you're wrong, and I'd like to prove it." Professor Whitman's eyebrows rose in what looked like amusement. "Very well. But when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to understand that some barriers exist for a reason. Angela walked to the blackboard, her sneakers silent on the polished floor. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting, the sharp intake of breath from her classmates. Some were sympathetic. Others were already writing her academic obituary. She picked up the chalk, its familiar weight grounding her. The equation stared back at her, complex and intimidating. But as she began to work, something magical happened. The classroom fell away. The whispers died. Even Professor Whitman's hostile presence faded into background noise. Mathematics had always been Angela's first language. Where others saw chaos, she saw patterns. Where others saw impossibility, she saw elegant solutions waiting to be discovered. Her mind began to race, making connections that others had missed, seeing relationships between variables that had been hidden in plain sight. The chalk flew across the board. Numbers cascaded into equations. Equations transformed into proofs. Proofs resolved into breathtaking simplicity. She wasn't just solving the problem. She was revealing something beautiful and profound about the nature of orbital mechanics itself. Impossible, she heard someone whisper. But Angela was just getting started. As she worked, she began to see something else, an error in the original formulation. A tiny mistake that would compound itself across millions of calculations. Her heart began to race as she realized the implications. "Professor Whitman," she said without turning around, her voice carrying a new note of authority. "There's something wrong with this equation. The coefficient here," she tapped the board with her chalk. "It's been miscalculated." "That," Professor Whitman said coldly, "is precisely the equation that NASA provided to this university. Are you suggesting that you know better than their top scientists?" Angela turned around, chalk dust on her fingers, fire in her eyes. "I'm not suggesting anything, Professor. I'm stating a fact. And I can prove it." The first twist had arrived. The problem that was supposed to humble her was about to reveal something much bigger than anyone in that room could imagine. The classroom had become a theater of tension. Angela stood at the blackboard, her solution gleaming in white chalk against the dark surface, while Professor Whitman's face had gone through several shades of red before settling into a dangerous shade of purple. "You arrogant little," he began, then caught himself. Even in his fury, he knew better than to complete that sentence in front of witnesses. Instead, he pulled out his phone with shaking fingers. "We'll see about this. I'm calling Dr. Richardson at NASA right now." "Professor," said David Kim, a senior student in the front row, "maybe we should look at her work first? I mean, the math seems..." "The math seems what, Mr. Kim?" Professor Whitman snapped. "Are you now an expert on orbital mechanics? This is precisely the problem with this generation. No respect for authority, no understanding of hierarchy." But Angela had already moved to a second blackboard. Her chalk was flying again, this time showing not just the corrected equation, but a complete derivation of where the original error had occurred. The mathematics was elegant, brutal, and undeniable. "The mistake," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word, "was made in the third-order approximation. Someone assumed that the gravitational interference from Jupiter's moons would be negligible, but they forgot to account for the resonance cascade effect when multiple bodies align. It's a rookie mistake, honestly." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Rookie mistake. From a 17-year-old girl to NASA's finest. Professor Whitman's call connected. "Richardson?" "Harold Whitman at MIT. "Yes, I need you to verify something immediately. One of my students claims to have found an error in the orbital calculations you sent us." Angela could hear the laughter on the other end of the line, tinny but unmistakable. I know," Professor Whitman continued, his confidence returning. "But I want to put this nonsense to rest once and for all. Can you run the numbers? The girl claims the coefficient in equation 7 should be..." Angela watched as Professor Whitman's face went through another transformation. The smugness drained away, replaced first by confusion, then by something that looked almost like fear. "What do you mean, run it again?" he said into the phone. "How long will that take?" "No, I understand the implications, but—" "Wait, what? How much money?" The conversation continued in hushed, urgent tones, but Angela could see the truth written on Professor Whitman's face. She had been right. Not just right, catastrophically right. Meanwhile, other students had approached the blackboard. Jennifer Liu, a doctoral candidate, was frantically taking photos of Angela's work with her phone. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Do you realize what you've just done?" "I solved a math problem," Angela said quietly, suddenly feeling the weight of 23 pairs of eyes on her. "No," said Jennifer, her voice filled with awe. "You just saved NASA about $2 billion. Maybe more." Professor Whitman ended his call and stood in stunned silence for a full 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow. "The launch," he said, barely above a whisper. "The Mars mission. It's scheduled for next week. They've been using these calculations for 18 months of planning." Angela felt her stomach drop. The Mars mission, she'd been following it in the news. The most ambitious space exploration project in human history. 3 years of travel, a crew of 6 astronauts, and a budget that had consumed nearly every spare dollar NASA could find. "What happens if they launch with the wrong calculations?" asked David Kim. Professor Whitman's face had gone ashen. "The trajectory would be off by approximately 47,000 miles. The spacecraft would," he swallowed hard, "would miss Mars entirely and continue into deep space. The crew would be lost." The silence that followed was deafening. Angela felt her knees go weak. 6 people. 6 human beings whose lives had been balanced on the edge of a mathematical error that she had caught in a classroom exercise. "Professor," she said, her voice barely audible, "we have to tell them. We have to make sure they know." But Professor Whitman was already moving, his academic arrogance replaced by something approaching panic. "Everyone out," he barked. "Class dismissed. Miss Buck, you stay." As the other students filed out, casting backward glances and whispering urgently to each other, Professor Whitman closed the door and turned to face Angela. When they were alone, his mask finally slipped entirely. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This conversation never happened. This mistake, it's not our problem. NASA has their own verification systems. If they missed something, that's on them." Angela stared at him in disbelief. "Professor, you just said 6 people could die." "I said the calculations might be off. NASA will figure it out. They have procedures. But what if they don't? What if they trust the math because it came from NASA, just like you trusted it because it came from NASA? What if everyone assumes someone else checked it?" Professor Whitman stepped closer, and for the first time, Angela felt genuinely afraid. "You're a smart girl, Miss Buck. Smart enough to understand that careers can be destroyed by the wrong word in the wrong ear. My career. Your career. The reputation of this entire department. I don't understand. Then let me make it clearer. If word gets out that a 17-year-old found an error that NASA's best mathematicians missed, heads will roll. Important heads. Powerful people will be looking for someone to blame. And you." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "You're a very convenient target." Angela felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Professor Whitman replied smoothly. "About how the real world works. About what happens to people who make waves. Especially people like you. People like you." There it was again. The phrase that reduced her entire existence to the color of her skin. Angela looked at the blackboard, where her calculations still gleamed like accusations against the dark surface. 6 lives. 6 people who were probably right now making final preparations, calling loved ones, making peace with the possibility that they might never return to Earth. And here was Professor Whitman, asking her to let them fly into oblivion to protect his reputation. "No," she said quietly. "Excuse me?" I said no. Her voice was stronger now, carrying the same authority it had held when she'd corrected his equation. "I won't stay quiet. I won't let people die to protect your career." Professor Whitman's face hardened. "Then you're a fool. And you'll learn exactly what happens to fools who don't know their place." He moved to the blackboard and began erasing her work, each swipe of the eraser removing hours of elegant mathematics. "There," he said when he was finished. "No evidence. No proof. Just your word against mine. And who do you think they'll believe?" Angela watched her work disappear and felt something fundamental shift inside her. The naive part of her, the part that had believed excellence would always be recognized and truth would always prevail, died in that moment. In its place, something harder and more determined was born. "You're right, Professor," she said calmly. "It is my word against yours. But you forgot one thing." "What's that?" Angela smiled, and for the first time since she'd entered his classroom, Professor Whitman looked uncertain. "I took pictures." She held up her phone, showing him the screen filled with images of her calculations. "Every step, every correction, every proof. And I sent them to my email account about 5 minutes ago." Professor Whitman lunged for her phone, but Angela was faster. She darted toward the door, her hand already on the handle. "You can erase the blackboard, Professor," she called back to him. "But you can't erase the truth. And you can't erase me." Angela burst through the door and into the hallway, where she found Jennifer Liu and David Kim waiting for her with several other students. "We heard shouting," Jennifer said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Angela said, though her heart was pounding. "But I need help. I need to get this information to NASA directly, and I need witnesses." "What's wrong?" David asked. "You look terrified." Angela glanced back at the classroom door, where she could see Professor Whitman's silhouette through the frosted glass. He was on his phone again, and his gestures suggested he was very, very angry. "Professor Whitman wants me to stay quiet about the error," she said. "He's more worried about embarrassment than he is about 6 people dying." The group of students exchanged looks of shock and disgust. "That's not happening," Jennifer said firmly. "I've got contacts at NASA through my research. We can get this to them directly." "And I've got everything recorded," said David, holding up his phone. "I started recording when he asked everyone to leave except you. The whole conversation is here. Dear viewers, what do you think motivates some people to prioritize reputation over human lives? Let us know your thoughts." Angela felt a surge of gratitude and something else, hope. For the first time since entering Professor Whitman's classroom, she wasn't alone. "There's something else," she said. "This might be bigger than just one error. If NASA's calculations were wrong about this, what else might they have missed? What other missions might be at risk?" Jennifer's eyes widened. "You're talking about a systematic review of their entire computational system." "I'm talking about making sure this never happens again," Angela said. "And making sure Professor Whitman never has the chance to silence another student." Behind them, the classroom door opened, and Professor Whitman stepped into the hallway. His face was calm now, but his eyes burned with something dangerous. "Miss Buck," he called out pleasantly, as if nothing had happened. "I've just had a wonderful conversation with the dean. He's very interested in discussing your academic future." The threat was clear, but Angela no longer felt afraid. She was surrounded by allies now, armed with truth and evidence. Most importantly, she had found her voice. "Tell the dean I'd be happy to meet with him," she replied. "I have quite a story to tell." The dean's office felt like a courtroom. Dr. Margaret Stern sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun that matched her expression. At 65, she had spent 4 decades navigating the treacherous waters of academic politics, and her face showed every battle she'd fought and won. Professor Whitman sat in one of the leather chairs facing her desk, his posture confident despite everything. To his left, Angela sat with Jennifer Liu and David Kim, flanking her like bodyguards. The evidence was spread across Dr. Stern's desk. Printed photos of Angela's calculations, David's phone with the recorded conversation, and a tablet displaying emails from NASA that had been flooding in for the past 2 hours. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Dr. Stern said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Miss Buck, you're alleging that Professor Whitman attempted to suppress information that could save human lives in order to protect his reputation." "I'm not alleging anything," Angela replied, her voice steady. "I'm stating facts. And I have proof." Professor Whitman leaned forward. "Margaret, surely you can see what's happening here. This girl embarrassed herself in class, and is now trying to deflect blame onto me. The calculations she claims to have corrected were provided directly from NASA. Are we really going to take the word of a 17-year-old over the space agency?" Dr. Stern's eyes flicked to the tablet on her desk. "Actually, Harold, we don't have to take anyone's word. NASA has spent the last 2 hours running Miss Buck's corrections through their systems." She paused, letting the tension build. "The launch has been delayed indefinitely." The silence that followed was profound. Angela felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the full implications sank in. "Furthermore," Dr. Stern continued, "I've received calls from Dr. Richardson, Dr. Patel from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and Administrator Chen from NASA headquarters. They're all very interested in speaking with Miss Buck. And they're all asking the same question. How did a 17-year-old catch an error that their entire computational team missed?" Professor Whitman's confident facade began to crack. "Now, Margaret, let's not get carried away. One small calculation error doesn't mean—" "It wasn't one error, Harold." Dr. Stern's voice cut through his protests like a blade. "NASA has been reviewing their computational protocols all morning. Miss Buck's correction revealed a systematic flaw in their verification process. A flaw that has affected not just the Mars mission, but potentially dozens of other projects." Angela felt the room spinning around her. "Dozens?" Dr. Stern nodded grimly. "Satellite deployments, space station supply missions, deep space probes. The same computational shortcuts that led to the Mars calculation error have been used throughout NASA's planning systems for the past 2 years. Jennifer Liu gripped Angela's arm. "My God," she whispered. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservative estimates suggest somewhere between $15 and $20 billion in potentially compromised missions," Dr. Stern replied. "Miss Buck, you may have just prevented the greatest disaster in space exploration history." Professor Whitman had gone pale. This is impossible. NASA has layers of verification. They have the best minds in the world working on these problems. They have the best minds following flawed procedures," Angela said quietly. "It doesn't matter how smart you are if you're using the wrong formula. And it doesn't matter how many people check your work if they're all using the same wrong formula." Dr. Stern leaned back in her chair, studying Professor Whitman with new eyes. "Harold, there's something else we need to discuss. NASA has requested copies of all correspondence between you and their computational team over the past 18 months. I don't understand why that's necessary." "Because, Professor Whitman," came a new voice from the doorway, "we need to understand how this error propagated through our systems." Everyone turned to see a woman in her 40s entering the office. She wore a NASA polo shirt and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to making life-and-death decisions. "Dr. Lisa Rodriguez," she said by way of introduction, "Deputy Administrator for Space Operations. I flew up from Houston this morning specifically to meet Miss Buck and to investigate how our partnership with MIT may have contributed to this crisis." Professor Whitman stood up abruptly. "Now see here. I've been working with NASA for over a decade. My credentials are impeccable. I won't be treated like some sort of criminal." Dr. Rodriguez fixed him with a stare that could have frozen helium. "Professor, 3 hours ago, I had to call 6 astronauts and tell them their mission, the mission they've trained 3 years for, was delayed because a teenager found an error our best mathematicians missed. Right now, I'm less concerned with your credentials than I am with your judgment." She turned to Angela, and her expression softened slightly. "Miss Buck, I owe you an apology. Our systems failed, but your insight may have saved 6 lives and prevented a disaster that would have set space exploration back decades." Angela felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all. "I just solved a math problem." "No," Dr. Rodriguez said firmly. "You did much more than that. You questioned authority when authority was wrong. You stood up for truth when it was inconvenient. And you refused to be silenced when someone tried to intimidate you." Professor Whitman's composure finally shattered completely. "This is absurd. I've dedicated my entire career to mathematical excellence. I've published papers, received awards, educated thousands of students. And you're going to destroy all of that because some girl got lucky with a calculation." "Lucky?" Angela stood up, and for the first time since entering the office, she let her anger show. "Lucky? Professor, I've been solving equations like this since I was 12 years old. I've spent every weekend for the past 3 years in advanced mathematics competitions. I've read every paper on orbital mechanics published in the last 5 years. This wasn't luck, this was preparation meeting opportunity." "You think you're so special?" Professor Whitman snarled, his mask of civility finally falling away completely. "You think because you can manipulate some numbers on a blackboard that you understand the real world? You have no idea what it takes to build a career, to earn respect, to intimidate students into silence when they threaten your ego?" Angela shot back. "To prioritize your reputation over human lives? To use racist language to try to make someone feel small and powerless?" Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward. "Racist language?" David Kim held up his phone. "It's all recorded." Professor Whitman told Angela that her kind don't do math, and later threatened her career if she didn't stay quiet about the calculation error. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dr. Stern's face had gone granite hard, while Dr. Rodriguez looked like she was barely containing her fury. "Harold," Dr. Stern said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is this true?" Professor Whitman looked around the room like a trapped animal. "You're taking that out of context. I was simply trying to explain the cultural factors that contribute to mathematical thinking. It's well-established research that certain backgrounds—" "Stop talking," Dr. Stern interrupted. "Just stop talking." She turned to Dr. Rodriguez. "I apologize on behalf of this institution. This behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of MIT. What happens now?" Angela asked. Dr. Rodriguez smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm expression anyone had seen since entering the office. "Now, Miss Buck, you're going to help us fix our systems. NASA is prepared to offer you a full scholarship, an internship position, and access to our computational teams. We want you to review our protocols and help us build better verification processes." "But I'm only 17. Katherine Johnson was 19 when she started calculating flight paths for NASA's predecessor organization," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Age is just a number. Brilliance is rare, and we'd be fools not to recognize it when we see it." Angela felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than frustration. For the first time in her academic career, she was being recognized not despite her age and background, but because of her capabilities. Dr. Stern stood up. "Professor Whitman, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the building." "You can't do this to me," Professor Whitman protested. "I have tenure. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Dr. Stern replied coldly. "I'd suggest you exercise it before you make this situation any worse for yourself." As security officers appeared to escort Professor Whitman out, he turned back to Angela one last time. His face was twisted with rage, and something that looked almost like fear. "This isn't over," he said. "You have no idea what you've started." Angela met his gaze steadily. "You're right, Professor. I don't think any of us know what I've started, but I'm looking forward to finding out." 2 days later, in Angela's dormitory room. Angela's phone had been ringing non-stop for 36 hours. CNN, BBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, MIT Technology Review. Every major news outlet in the world wanted to interview the 17-year-old who had saved NASA. Her small dorm room had become command central, with Jennifer and David taking turns screening calls while Angela tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. "Angela, it's Dr. Rodriguez again," Jennifer called out, holding up the landline phone. "She says it's urgent." Angela picked up the extension, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Dr. Rodriguez? Angela, I need you to listen carefully. We've completed the preliminary review of our computational systems using your methodology. The situation is worse than we initially thought." Angela felt her stomach drop. "How much worse?" "We've identified calculation errors in 17 active missions, including the International Space Station resupply schedule and the James Webb Telescope calibrations. But that's not why I'm calling." Dr. Rodriguez paused. "Someone leaked your story to the press, and it's about to go viral. Are you prepared for that?" Before Angela could answer, David burst through the door with his laptop. "Angela, you need to see this. Now." The headline on his screen made her blood run cold. "Racist Professor Silences Black Genius Student Who Discovered NASA's Billion-Dollar Mistake." The article was accompanied by a photo of Angela at the blackboard, taken by one of her classmates during that fateful class. Below it was another photo, Professor Whitman being escorted from the building by security, his face twisted with rage. "Oh no," Angela whispered. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You made a big mistake, girl. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Then another, "Your 15 minutes are almost up." And another, "Uppity little bitch thinks she's special." Jennifer grabbed the phone from her hands. "Block these numbers. All of them." "There are too many," Angela said, watching as message after message flooded in. Some were supportive, but many were filled with hate that made her feel physically sick. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media. #AngelaBuck was trending worldwide, alongside #MATHMatters and #NSAGate. The dormitory lobby was packed with reporters, and campus security had to set up barriers to keep them from entering the residential buildings. Angela sat in her room, watching the coverage on multiple news channels, feeling increasingly overwhelmed. "This is CNN breaking news," announced the anchor on screen. "The 17-year-old MIT student, whose mathematical discovery prevented what could have been NASA's greatest disaster, is now speaking out about the racist treatment she received from her professor." The story cut to an interview with Dr. Rodriguez, who was standing in front of NASA headquarters. "Miss Buck's discovery has forced us to completely overhaul our computational verification systems. We estimate her work has already saved taxpayers over $20 billion and potentially prevented multiple mission failures." But then the coverage shifted, and Angela watched in horror as the camera cut to Professor Whitman, standing on the steps of what looked like a courthouse, flanked by lawyers. "Professor Harold Whitman, who has taught at MIT for 35 years, the reporter announced, is fighting back against what he calls a character assassination campaign orchestrated to destroy his career." Professor Whitman stepped up to a cluster of microphones, his appearance polished and confident, a stark contrast to the man who had been escorted from the dean's office 2 days earlier. "I want to be very clear about what happened in my classroom," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in academia. "Miss Buck is an intelligent young woman, but she has been coached and manipulated by political activists who want to destroy traditional academic standards." Angela felt her blood turn to ice. The so-called error, she discovered, was actually a known approximation that NASA uses for preliminary calculations. This entire incident has been manufactured to advance a political agenda at the expense of academic integrity. He's lying, Angela breathed, watching as Professor Whitman continued his press conference. Furthermore, he continued, the recording that has been circulated was edited and taken out of context. At no point did I make racist statements. I was simply explaining the mathematical concepts in terms that Miss Buck could understand. David slammed his laptop shut. That's complete bullshit. I have the full recording. Nothing was edited. But Angela could see the damage being done in real time. Social media was already beginning to shift. Hashtags like #WhitmanTruth and #AcademicIntegrity were starting to trend alongside the original story. Her phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Stern. Angela, I need you to come to my office immediately and bring Mr. Kim and the original recording. What's happening? Professor Whitman has filed a lawsuit against you, David, Jennifer, and the university. He's claiming defamation, conspiracy, and breach of academic confidentiality. He's also demanding immediate reinstatement with full back pay. Angela felt the world spinning around her. Can he do that? He can try. That's why we need to move quickly. NASA is sending their legal team, and we need to coordinate our response. The dean's office was now packed with lawyers. NASA's legal team sat on one side, MIT's attorneys on the other, while Angela, Jennifer, and David huddled together in chairs that suddenly felt very small. The situation is complex, explained Sarah Chun, NASA's chief legal counsel. Professor Whitman's lawyers are arguing that Angela's correction was actually based on classified information that she shouldn't have had access to. They're claiming the entire incident was staged. That's insane, Jennifer protested. The equation was written on the blackboard in front of the entire class. They're also claiming, continued the lawyer, that the recording was obtained illegally and that David violated Massachusetts wiretapping laws by recording without consent. Angela felt her chest tightening. What does this mean for me? It means, said another lawyer, that if Professor Whitman's lawsuit succeeds, you could face criminal charges for industrial espionage. The scholarship and internship opportunities with NASA could disappear, and your academic career could be over before it starts. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Dr. Stern's antique clock. However, the lawyer continued, there's something Professor Whitman doesn't know. Something that changes everything. She opened a folder and pulled out several documents. NASA has been conducting their own internal investigation since this incident began. They've discovered that Professor Whitman has been receiving consulting fees from a private aerospace company called Titan Space Industries, a direct competitor to NASA. Angela looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means Professor Whitman had a financial incentive to ensure that NASA's missions failed. If NASA's Mars mission had been lost due to calculation errors, Titan Space would have been positioned to win billions of dollars in replacement contracts. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Are you saying he knew about the error? David asked. We're saying the FBI is now investigating whether Professor Whitman deliberately provided flawed calculations to NASA as part of an industrial sabotage scheme. Angela felt a mixture of vindication and fear. If this is true, then he wasn't just trying to humiliate me in class. He was trying to cover up his own crimes. Dr. Stern nodded grimly. It appears that way. When you caught his error, you didn't just solve a math problem. You accidentally exposed what may be one of the largest cases of industrial espionage in aerospace history. Which explains, added the NASA lawyer, why he was so desperate to silence you. Your discovery threatened to unravel his entire operation. Angela's phone buzzed with another text message. This one was different. Stop digging or you'll regret it. Last warning. She showed the message to the lawyers, who exchanged concerned glances. Angela, Dr. Stern said seriously, I think it's time we contacted the FBI directly. This has moved beyond academic disputes and defamation lawsuits. If Professor Whitman is involved in industrial espionage, you may be in actual danger. As if summoned by her words, there was a sharp knock on the office door. Dr. Stern's secretary entered, looking flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are 2 FBI agents here to see Miss Buck. They say it's urgent." Angela looked around the room, at all the concerned faces staring back at her. 2 days ago, she had been a quiet mathematics student trying to survive Professor Whitman's class. Now she was apparently at the center of a federal investigation involving industrial espionage, racist intimidation, and threats to national security. "Send them in," she said quietly. "I think it's time I learned exactly what I've gotten myself into." The door opened, and 2 agents in dark suits entered the office. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "Miss Buck, I'm Agent Patricia Martinez with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. We need to talk." The interrogation room was nothing like Angela had seen in movies. Instead of harsh fluorescent lights and metal chairs, it looked more like a conference room in a corporate office. Polished with table, comfortable chairs, and a wall-mounted screen displaying complex financial charts and timeline graphics. Agent Martinez sat across from Angela, with Agent Robert Chong flanking her. Dr. Rodriguez and one of NASA's lawyers sat to Angela's right, while her own attorney, hastily provided by MIT, reviewed documents at the far end of the table. "Miss Buck," Agent Martinez began, "you're not in any trouble. In fact, you may have helped us crack a case we've been working on for over 2 years. But we need your help to understand exactly what happened in that classroom." Angela nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "I'll tell you everything I can remember." Agent Chong activated a recording device. "For the record, this is a voluntary statement from Angela Buck regarding the incidents at MIT involving Professor Harold Whitman and potential industrial espionage activities." Agent Martinez pulled up the first slide on the wall screen. It showed a complex web of financial connections between Titan Space Industries, several offshore shell companies, and what appeared to be Professor Whitman's bank accounts. "We've been investigating Titan Space Industries since 2023, Agent Martinez explained. "They're a private aerospace company that's been trying to secure NASA contracts worth approximately $50 billion over the next decade. Our investigation suggests they've been engaged in systematic industrial sabotage designed to undermine NASA's credibility and create opportunities for private companies to take over government space operations." The next slide showed photographs of several men in expensive suits. The CEO of Titan Space is Marcus Blackwood, former Pentagon procurement officer. He's assembled a team of former government officials and has been using their security clearances and industry connections to access classified NASA information. Angela studied the photos, then pointed to one of the men. "I've seen him before. He came to Professor Whitman's office about a month ago. I was there for office hours, and Professor Whitman asked me to wait outside while they met." Agent Chong made a note. "Can you remember anything about their conversation?" "Not much. But Professor Whitman seemed nervous afterward, and he gave me a really strange assignment that week. Something about calculating trajectory errors for hypothetical Mars missions. I thought it was just academic exercise." "It wasn't," Agent Martinez said grimly. "We believe Professor Whitman was using his students to help develop the sabotage protocols without their knowledge. He would give you problems designed to identify vulnerabilities in NASA's systems, then pass your solutions to Titan Space." Angela felt sick. "You mean I've been helping them this whole time?" "No," Dr. Rodriguez interjected firmly. "You've been doing mathematics. Professor Whitman was exploiting your work, but that's on him, not you." Agent Martinez pulled up another slide, this one showing email communications. "There's something else, Angela. We've recovered Professor Whitman's communications with Titan Space leadership. The racist comments he made to you weren't just personal prejudice, they were strategic. I don't understand. Agent Chong took over. Titan Space business model depends on convincing government officials that NASA is incompetent and unreliable. They've been systematically undermining confidence in NASA's diversity and inclusion initiatives, arguing that political correctness has compromised NASA's scientific integrity. Angela's stomach churned as the implications became clear. So when I solved the problem that their sabotage had created, you proved that their entire narrative was false, Agent Martinez finished. A 17-year-old black woman had just demonstrated more mathematical competence than their entire conspiracy. If that became public knowledge, it would destroy their claims about NASA's declining standards. That's why he was so desperate to silence you, Dr. Rodriguez added. Your success wasn't just embarrassing to him personally, it was a threat to a $50 billion conspiracy. The next series of slides revealed the true scope of the operation. Titan Space had cultivated relationships with professors at multiple universities, defense contractors, and even some NASA employees. The goal was to create systematic failures that would justify privatizing space exploration. Professor Whitman wasn't the only academic involved, Agent Martinez explained. We've identified similar operations at Stanford, Caltech, and Georgia Tech. Professors were being paid to introduce subtle errors into NASA's collaborative research projects. Angela felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. How many missions could have been affected? Agent Chong consulted his notes. Conservatively, dozens. The Mars mission was just the most visible target. If their plan had succeeded, the failure would have provided justification for Congress to defund NASA and transfer their budget to private contractors like Titan Space. But there's good news, Agent Martinez said. Your discovery didn't just save the Mars mission, it exposed the entire network. We've been able to trace the connections, freeze assets, and coordinate with international law enforcement to shut down the offshore accounts. Agent Martinez's expression grew more serious. Angela, there's something else we need to discuss. The threats you've been receiving aren't just random internet trolls. Some of them are coming from people connected to this conspiracy. She pulled up screenshots of the threatening messages Angela had received, now annotated with IP addresses and user identification information. We've traced several of these messages to Titan Space employees and their associates. This suggests they see you as a continuing threat to their operations. Angela's attorney leaned forward. What kind of protection can you provide? We're working on that, Agent Chong replied. But first, we need Angela's help with something. Professor Whitman's lawyers have been claiming that the entire incident was fabricated, that Angela somehow had advanced knowledge of the calculation errors and staged the whole thing for publicity. That's ridiculous, Angela protested. We know it is, but we need to prove it conclusively. Are you willing to undergo a formal mathematical competency evaluation? We'd like to bring in independent experts to verify that you could have identified these errors on your own, without any outside assistance. Angela looked around the room at all the adults who were suddenly depending on her: agents, lawyers, NASA officials, university administrators. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. What if I can't do it again? She asked quietly. What if it really was just luck? Dr. Rodriguez reached across the table and took Angela's hand. Angela, in the past 3 days, you've helped us identify calculation errors in 17 different NASA projects. Each time, you've provided elegant, innovative solutions that our best mathematicians hadn't considered. This isn't luck, this is who you are. Agent Martinez pulled up a final slide, showing what looked like an incredibly complex mathematical equation, far more complicated than anything Angela had worked on before. This is a trajectory calculation for a theoretical Jupiter mission that Titan Space claims is impossible for NASA to solve safely. They've been using this as an example of why space exploration should be privatized. If you can solve it, it will definitively prove that their claims about NASA's declining capabilities are false. Angela studied the equation, feeling her mind begin to race as she identified the variables and relationships. It was complex, certainly, but she could already see several potential approaches. "How long do I have?" she asked. Agent Martinez smiled. "However long you need." "But Angela, the entire future of American space exploration may depend on what you do next." As Angela stared at the equation, she realized that this moment was bigger than just proving her own abilities or exposing Professor Whitman's crimes. This was about something fundamental, the question of who gets to dream about the stars and whose minds are considered worthy of reaching them. "I'll need a blackboard," she said quietly. "And about 2 hours." Agent Chong stood up. "I'll get you whatever you need." As the agents began preparing the testing room, Angela caught her reflection in the conference room window. 2 weeks ago, she had been invisible, just another student trying to survive a hostile classroom. Now she was about to help determine the future of space exploration. Professor Whitman had been wrong about so many things, but especially about one. Her kind didn't just do math. Her kind was about to save the future. The blackboard stretched across an entire wall, pristine white chalk waiting like a loaded weapon. Angela stood before it, surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in aerospace engineering. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Caltech, Dr. James Wright from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Dr. Priya Sharma from MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, all brought in as independent witnesses to verify what was about to happen. Agent Martinez sat at the observation table with Dr. Rodriguez and Angela's legal team. The air hummed with tension and possibility. "Before we begin," Dr. Vasquez announced, "I want to establish the parameters. This trajectory calculation has been reviewed by teams from 3 different aerospace companies and 2 government agencies. The consensus is that it's unsolvable with current computational methods." She gestured to the complex equation displayed on the wall screen. "The Jupiter mission requires accounting for gravitational interference from 17 different celestial bodies, radiation variations that affect instrument calibration, and fuel consumption calculations that must remain accurate across a 7-year flight path. Previous attempts have failed because the margin of error compounds exponentially over time." Angela nodded, studying the equation. But she was also listening to something else, the whispers of doubt from around the room. "She's 17, she heard Dr. Wright murmur to his colleague. "Even if she's brilliant, this requires years of specialized experience. The pressure alone will break her," came another whisper. "This isn't a classroom exercise anymore." Angela picked up the chalk, feeling its familiar weight center her. Then she began to write. What happened next was unlike anything the observers had ever witnessed. Angela didn't approach the problem linearly, the way she had been taught in traditional mathematics courses. Instead, she began to build a 3-dimensional mathematical architecture, using different sections of the blackboard to explore parallel solution paths simultaneously. Her chalk flew across the board with the precision of a conductor's baton. In the upper left corner, she attacked the gravitational interference problem using a modified version of chaos theory. In the center, she constructed an elegant proof that simplified the radiation calculations by treating them as wave functions rather than discrete variables. On the right side, she developed an entirely new approach to fuel consumption that accounted for the psychological and physical changes in the crew over time. "Impossible," breathed Dr. Sharma. "She's solving 3 distinct problems simultaneously and somehow keeping track of how they interact." But Angela was just getting started. As she worked, patterns began to emerge that connected the different mathematical approaches in ways that the observers had never considered. "Look at what she's doing," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. "She's not just solving the problem. She's revealing something fundamental about how these systems actually work. The breakthrough came in the second hour. Angela suddenly stopped writing and stepped back from the board, staring at her work with an expression of wonder. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, that's beautiful." She turned to face the room full of experts. The reason everyone's been failing isn't because the problem is unsolvable. It's because they've been treating it as an engineering challenge when it's actually an ecological one. Angela returned to the board and began connecting her 3 separate solution paths with elegant curved lines that transformed the entire equation into something that looked almost organic. "Jupiter isn't just a destination," she explained as she worked. "It's the center of its own complex ecosystem of moons, radiation belts, and gravitational fields. You can't calculate a trajectory through that system using traditional orbital mechanics because the system itself is alive and constantly changing." She wrote a new equation that seemed to breathe on the blackboard, with variables that flowed into each other like water. But if you treat the spacecraft as part of the ecosystem rather than as an intrusion into it, the mathematics becomes elegant. She stepped back again, revealing a solution that was simultaneously complex and beautifully simple. The room fell silent. Dr. Vasquez approached the blackboard, studying Angela's work with the intensity of an art critic examining a masterpiece. "This is..." She paused, struggling for words. "This is revolutionary. You've just rewritten fundamental assumptions about space navigation." Dr. Wright was frantically photographing the equations with his phone. "The fuel efficiency calculations alone could change how we design every future mission. This approach could reduce mission costs by 60%. But Dr. Sharma was staring at Angela with something approaching awe. "How long have you been thinking about space navigation as an ecological system?" Angela looked surprised by the question. "Since this morning, when I first saw the problem. It just seemed obvious that treating space as empty was the wrong approach." Agent Martinez had been quietly coordinating with NASA's computational teams throughout Angela's demonstration. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and her face broke into a smile. "Angela, NASA has been running your calculations through their supercomputer systems for the past hour. Your solution doesn't just work. It's more accurate than any trajectory calculation they've ever produced." Dr. Rodriguez stood up, her voice filled with emotion. "Angela, do you understand what you've just done? You haven't just solved an impossible problem. You've pioneered an entirely new approach to space exploration." But Angela was looking at something else on the blackboard. A small notation she had made in the corner while working through the radiation calculations. "There's something else," she said quietly. "While I was working on this, I noticed something about the Titan space sabotage. The errors Professor Whitman was introducing weren't random." She moved to a clear section of the blackboard and began recreating some of the flawed calculations from the Mars mission. "Look at this pattern," she said, circling specific numbers. "The errors are strategic. They're designed to fail in specific ways that would make it look like NASA's diversity initiatives were causing computational incompetence." Agent Chong leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "The sabotage was racist by design," Angela explained, her voice growing stronger. "Every error was calculated to reinforce stereotypes about who belongs in STEM fields. The Mars mission wasn't just going to fail, it was going to fail in a way that would be used to justify excluding people like me from space exploration." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. "They weren't just trying to steal NASA's contracts," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice filled with anger. "They were trying to roll back decades of progress in scientific diversity." Angela set down her chalk and turned to face the room full of adults who were staring at her with a mixture of admiration and shock. "I want you all to understand something," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority. "For my entire academic career, I've been told that I need to be twice as good to get half the recognition. I've been told that my background is a disadvantage, that I don't belong in advanced mathematics, that my success is due to lowered standards or special treatment. She gestured to the blackboard behind her, covered with revolutionary mathematics that had just redefined space exploration. But the truth is the opposite. My background, my experience of being underestimated, of having to find creative solutions to problems that others ignore, of seeing patterns that established thinking misses. That's not a disadvantage. That's exactly what mathematics needs. Dr. Vasquez began to applaud, followed by the other scientists, and then everyone in the room. But Angela held up a hand. "I'm not finished," she said. "Professor Whitman was wrong about almost everything, but he was right about one thing. This is going to change everything. Not just for space exploration, but for who gets to participate in it." She looked directly at Agent Martinez. "I want to help you finish this investigation. I want to testify against Professor Whitman and Titan Space Industries. And I want the world to understand that diversity in STEM isn't about fairness or political correctness. It's about solving impossible problems." Agent Martinez smiled. "What do you want to happen to Professor Whitman?" Angela considered the question carefully. "I want him to lose his job, obviously. I want him to face consequences for what he did to me and to NASA and to all the students he tried to intimidate over the years. But more than that." She paused, looking at her revolutionary equations on the blackboard. "I want him to have to live in a world where people like me are running NASA, where the future of space exploration is being designed by the very minds he tried to exclude. I want him to watch from the outside as we reach for the stars." Dear viewers, what do you think drives some people to try to limit others' potential instead of celebrating human achievement? Let us know your thoughts. As if summoned by her words, Agent Chang's phone rang. He listened for a moment, then looked up with a grin. That was the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, including Angela's testimony and mathematical analysis, they're filing federal charges against Professor Whitman and 7 executives from Titan Space Industries. The charges include conspiracy to commit industrial espionage, mail fraud, and civil rights violations." Angela felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her, but also something deeper, a sense that justice was finally within reach. "When do we go public with this?" she asked. Agent Martinez stood up. "Tomorrow morning. NASA is calling a press conference to announce both the Jupiter mission breakthrough and the arrest of the sabotage network." "And Angela?" "Yes. They want you to be the one to explain the mathematics to the world." The media circus had grown exponentially overnight. Reporters from every major news outlet in the world packed the auditorium, their cameras focused on the podium where Angela would soon stand. The gravity of the moment was palpable. This wasn't just about mathematics or space exploration anymore. This had become a defining moment in the conversation about who gets to shape humanity's future. Behind the stage, Angela stood with Dr. Rodriguez, Agent Martinez, and Administrator Rebecca Chun, NASA's highest-ranking official. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices and the clicking of camera shutters. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Rodriguez asked gently. Angela looked down at her hands, which were surprisingly steady despite everything. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a quiet classroom where she'd been told her kind didn't do math, to standing at the threshold of changing history. "I've been ready my whole life," she said quietly. "I just didn't know it." Administrator Chen stepped forward. "Angela, before we go out there, I want you to know that NASA is prepared to offer you a full scholarship, guaranteed admission to our astronaut training program, and a position leading our new computational innovation division. We're talking about a direct path to becoming one of the youngest astronauts in history." Angela felt her breath catch. "You're offering me everything I've ever dreamed of." "We're offering you what you've earned," Administrator Chen replied. "But first, we need to deal with what's happening out there." Through the curtain, Angela could hear the crowd growing restless. But there was something else, chanting from outside the building. "What's that noise?" she asked. Agent Martinez's expression darkened. Titan Space has organized counter-protesters. They're claiming this entire investigation is a politically motivated attack on traditional academic values. As they walked toward the stage entrance, Angela caught a glimpse of the protesters through a side window. Dozens of people carrying signs that made her stomach turn. Merit not identity, stop reverse racism in STEM, and most disturbing, Whitman was right. But there were counter-protesters too, carrying signs that read Justice for Angela, Math has no color, and the future is now. There's something else, Administrator Chen said, her voice tense. Professor Whitman is here. Angela stopped walking. What do you mean he's here? His lawyers arranged for him to make a statement to the press after your presentation. They're claiming he has evidence that will discredit everything you've said. Agent Martinez stepped forward. Angela, you don't have to face him. We can arrange. No, Angela interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm not running from him anymore. If he wants a public confrontation, he can have one. The stage lights were blinding as Angela walked to the podium. The crowd fell silent, and she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, a massive screen displayed her revolutionary Jupiter mission calculations. Ladies and gentlemen, Administrator Chen announced, I present Dr. Angela Buck. The title caught Angela off guard. She hadn't earned a doctorate yet. But Administrator Chen leaned into the microphone. NASA is conferring an honorary doctorate in applied mathematics on Miss Buck in recognition of her revolutionary contributions to space exploration. The applause was thunderous, but Angela could also hear the boos and jeers from the protesters outside. She approached the microphone, her notes forgotten. Instead, she spoke from the heart. 3 days ago, I was a 17-year-old student trying to survive a hostile classroom. Today, I'm standing here because I refused to let anyone tell me that my mind wasn't worth listening to. Her voice carried clearly through the auditorium and to the millions watching on live television around the world. Mathematics doesn't see color. It doesn't care about your background or your zip code or what anyone thinks about your potential. Mathematical truth is absolute. And the truth is this: diversity in STEM isn't about charity or political correctness. It's about survival. She gestured to the screen behind her. The Jupiter mission calculations that everyone said were impossible? I solved them by approaching the problem differently than anyone had before. Not because I'm special, but because my perspective, shaped by my experiences as a young black woman in STEM, allowed me to see patterns that others missed. Angela moved to a blackboard that had been set up on stage. Let me show you something that will change how we think about space exploration forever. She began writing, her movements confident and fluid. The cameras zoomed in as she constructed a mathematical proof that transformed complex orbital mechanics into something almost poetic. Traditional space navigation treats the universe as empty space with obstacles to avoid, she explained as she worked. But space isn't empty. It's a living ecosystem of gravitational fields, radiation patterns, and electromagnetic forces. When you treat your spacecraft as part of that ecosystem instead of as an intruder, the mathematics becomes beautiful. The equation that emerged on the blackboard was unlike anything the audience had ever seen. It seemed to flow and breathe, with variables that connected in ways that revealed the hidden poetry of physics. Dr. Rodriguez stood up from the front row. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is the mathematical breakthrough that will make Mars colonization economically viable and Jupiter exploration scientifically practical. Miss Buck hasn't just solved individual problems. She's pioneered an entirely new field of mathematics. The applause was overwhelming, but Angela held up her hand for silence. There's something else you need to know. This breakthrough almost never happened. It was nearly buried by a conspiracy designed to destroy NASA and exclude people like me from space exploration. The room fell deadly silent as Angela began to explain the full scope of the Titan Space conspiracy. She detailed Professor Whitman's racist comments, his attempts to silence her, and the systematic sabotage that had endangered lives and wasted billions of dollars. The people behind this conspiracy didn't just want to steal NASA's contracts, she said, her voice growing stronger. They wanted to prove that diversity initiatives were making America's space program weaker. They were willing to let astronauts die to make that point. From the back of the auditorium, a door opened. Professor Whitman entered, flanked by lawyers and security guards. He looked older than Angela remembered, his hair disheveled and his face gaunt. But his eyes still burned with the same arrogance she had faced in his classroom. "That's enough," he called out, his voice carrying across the auditorium. "I won't stand here and listen to these lies anymore." Administrator Chen stepped to the microphone. "Professor Whitman, you're not scheduled to speak until—" "I'm speaking now," he interrupted, pushing past security to approach the stage. "This entire charade is built on the fantasies of a delusional teenager who stumbled onto a calculation that any competent mathematician could have made." Angela felt the familiar chill of his presence, but this time it was different. She was no longer the scared student in his classroom. She was standing on a stage, surrounded by allies, backed by irrefutable mathematical proof. "Professor Whitman," she said calmly, "would you like to solve the Jupiter mission calculation yourself? Right here, in front of everyone." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Professor Whitman's face went through several shades of red before he managed to speak. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to some affirmative action case study who—" He never got to finish the sentence. Agent Martinez had appeared beside him with handcuffs. "Professor Harold Whitman," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone system. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit industrial espionage, wire fraud, and violation of federal civil rights laws." As Professor Whitman was led away in handcuffs, his composed facade finally cracked completely. He turned back toward Angela, his face twisted with rage and something that looked like desperation. "You think you've won?" he shouted as security dragged him toward the exit. "You think this changes anything? There will always be people like me, and there will always be people who know that some minds are simply superior to others." Angela walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at the man who had tried to destroy her future. "You're right, Professor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "There will always be people like you, but there will also always be people like me. And we're going to the stars." The last image the cameras captured of Professor Whitman was of him being pushed through the exit doors, his shouts fading into silence, while behind him Angela Buck stood bathed in light, her revolutionary mathematics glowing on the screen behind her. The applause that followed shook the building. But for Angela, the sweetest sound was something else entirely. The sound of her own voice, strong and clear and unafraid, echoing through a room full of people who were finally listening. As the press conference ended and reporters rushed to file their stories, Angela realized that Professor Whitman had been wrong about one final thing. This wasn't the end of anything. This was the beginning of everything. 6 months later at MIT campus, the autumn leaves crunched under Angela's feet as she walked across the MIT campus that had once felt so hostile and now felt like home. Everything had changed, yet somehow everything felt exactly as it should be. The morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and Angela could hear the familiar sounds of students discussing complex problems. But now those conversations often included her name and her revolutionary mathematical approaches. She was heading to what used to be Professor Whitman's office, now converted into the Angela Buck Center for Innovative Mathematics. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she'd insisted the space be used to help other students who might face the same barriers she had overcome. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Rodriguez. "Turn on CNN. Now." Angela ducked into the nearest building and found a television in the student lounge. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made her heart race. Professor Whitman sentenced to 15 years, in federal prison. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In a stunning conclusion to one of the largest industrial espionage cases in American history, former MIT professor Harold Whitman was sentenced today to 15 years in federal prison. Judge Rebecca Morrison called Whitman's crimes a betrayal of academic integrity and a threat to national security. The screen cut to footage from outside the federal courthouse. Professor Whitman, looking years older and wearing an orange jumpsuit, was being led away in shackles. Gone was the arrogant professor who had tried to humiliate her in class. In his place was a broken man who had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom. In related news, the anchor continued, Titan Space Industries has been disbanded, with 7 executives receiving sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The company's assets, totaling over $3 billion, have been liquidated to pay damages to NASA and fund new STEM education initiatives for underserved communities. Angela felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but she took no joy in seeing anyone's life destroyed. Still, she couldn't forget that Professor Whitman had been willing to let astronauts die to protect his conspiracy. Her phone rang. It was Administrator Chun from NASA. Angela, have you seen the news? I'm watching it now. There's something else. The President wants to meet with you next week. She's announcing a new initiative to reform STEM education nationwide, and she wants you to help design the program. Angela felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. What kind of program? We're calling it the Angela Buck Initiative for Mathematical Innovation. The goal is to identify and support young mathematicians from underrepresented communities, provide them with resources and mentorship, and create pathways into aerospace careers. Over the following weeks, Angela watched as her story continued to create waves around the world. Universities across the country began reviewing their own faculty for similar conflicts of interest. NASA implemented new verification protocols based on her mathematical approaches. Most importantly, applications from underrepresented students to STEM programs increased by over 200%. But it was a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning that affected Angela most profoundly. Dear Dr. Buck, my name is Maria Santos, and I'm 12 years old. I saw you on television, and my math teacher showed our class your Jupyter calculations. I used to think that kids like me, I'm Mexican American and my family doesn't have much money, couldn't become mathematicians. But when I saw you standing up to that professor and solving problems that nobody else could solve, I realized that maybe I could do it too. I've been working on a problem about water distribution systems in drought areas, and I think I might have found a new approach using some of your ecological mathematics ideas. Would you be willing to look at my work? Thank you for showing me that girls like us can reach for the stars. Your fan, Maria. Angela wiped away tears as she finished reading. This was why everything had been worth it. Not for her own recognition, but to light the way for others. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Jennifer Liu and David Kim, both grinning widely. We have news, Jennifer announced. David got accepted to NASA's graduate program, and I've been offered a position on the Mars mission computational team. Angela jumped up to hug them both. That's incredible. When do you start? Next month, David replied. And Jennifer, tell her the best part. Jennifer's grin widened. The mission commander specifically requested us because of our association with you. Apparently, your mathematical approaches are being integrated into every aspect of the mission planning. Also, David added, pulling out his phone, you need to see this. He showed her a video that had gone viral on social media. It was footage from MIT's latest incoming student orientation, where the dean was addressing a record-breaking diverse class of new mathematics students. This is what we call the Angela Buck effect, the dean was saying in the video. Applications from underrepresented students have increased 300% since Dr. Buck's breakthrough. But more importantly, these students are arriving with innovative approaches to mathematics that are pushing the boundaries of what we thought possible. The camera panned across the audience, showing faces that reflected every ethnicity and background. Many of the students were wearing T-shirts with mathematical equations, Angela's equations, printed on them. Angela's phone buzzed with an international call. The caller ID showed it was from Dr. Amina Okafor at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Dr. Buck, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm calling because your mathematical approaches have revolutionized our satellite communication projects here in Africa. We're using your ecological systems theory to design more efficient networks for rural internet access. That's wonderful, Angela replied, though she was still adjusting to being called Dr. Buck by people twice her age. But that's not why I'm calling. I want you to know that your story, what you did, how you stood up to that professor, has inspired a generation of young African mathematicians. We've started what we call Angela Buck Mathematics Clubs in schools across the continent. Children who would never have considered STEM careers are now solving problems that our university students struggle with. After the call ended, Angela sat quietly in her office, processing the magnitude of what had grown from that single moment in Professor Whitman's classroom. Her mathematical breakthrough had been important, but the real change was cultural and social. She had helped prove that excellence could come from anywhere, that diversity wasn't a weakness, but a source of strength. Her reflection was interrupted by another knock. This time it was Dr. Rodriguez, carrying what looked like official NASA documents. Angela, I have your mission assignment. Angela's heart stopped. Mission assignment? Dr. Rodriguez smiled. You're officially selected for the Jupiter mission crew. If you accept, you'll be the youngest person ever to travel to the outer solar system. You'll also be the mission's chief mathematician, responsible for real-time trajectory calculations during the 7-year journey. Angela stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, the chance to use her mathematics not just to solve problems on Earth, but to explore the cosmos itself. There's one condition, Dr. Rodriguez added. NASA wants you to document the entire journey. They want to create an educational program that follows your work throughout the mission. You'd be showing millions of young people around the world that the stars are within their reach too. Angela thought about Maria Santos and her water distribution project. She thought about the mathematics clubs in Africa and the record-breaking diversity in STEM programs. She thought about all the young minds that might be inspired to push further, dream bigger, reach higher. When do we launch? She asked. Dr. Rodriguez grinned. 18 months. Just enough time to complete your undergraduate degree and begin astronaut training. As Angela signed the mission documents, she realized that Professor Whitman had been accidentally prophetic about one thing. This really had changed everything, but not in the way he'd intended. Standing in the office that had once belonged to the man who tried to destroy her future, Angela Buck, mathematician, revolutionary, and soon-to-be astronaut, looked out the window at the sky that would soon be her destination. The stars that Professor Whitman had tried to put beyond her reach now awaited her arrival. The future, it turned out, belonged to those brave enough to reach for it. 5 years later, Jupiter's orbit. The observation deck of the starship Endeavour offered a view that no human being had ever witnessed before. Jupiter filled the entire viewport, its great red spot swirling like a cosmic eye, while its moons danced in perfect mathematical precision around the giant planet. Angela floated in the zero gravity, her notebook filled with calculations that were reshaping humanity's understanding of the outer solar system. At 23, she had become the most famous mathematician in the world, but more importantly, she had become exactly who she was meant to be. The scared 17-year-old, who had once trembled in Professor Whitman's classroom, was now commanding the most ambitious space mission in human history. "Dr. Buck to Mission Control," she said into her communication headset. "We've successfully entered Jupiter's orbital system using the ecological navigation protocols. Fuel consumption is 67% below projections, and all systems are operating perfectly. The response from Earth, delayed by the 43 minutes it took radio signals to travel across the solar system, crackled through the speakers. Outstanding work, Dr. Buck. The President wants you to know that your mission is being watched by over 2 billion people worldwide." Angela smiled as she made notes about the gravitational interactions between Io, Europa, and Ganymede. Her mathematical models hadn't just made this mission possible. They had made it economical enough for NASA to plan 12 follow-up missions over the next 2 decades. A gentle hand on her shoulder interrupted her calculations. She turned to see Dr. Elena Vasquez floating beside her, her dark eyes reflecting the amber light of Jupiter. The most brilliant mathematician in the solar system shouldn't be working through dinner, Elena said with the warm smile that had been making Angela's heart race for the past 2 years. Their relationship had been unexpected. A slow burn that had started with mutual respect for each other's work and gradually deepened into something that neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. Elena, now 42, had been one of the independent experts who had validated Angela's breakthrough 5 years ago. What had begun as professional admiration had evolved into partnership, and then into love. "The orbital resonance calculations won't finish themselves," Angela replied, but she saved her work and closed the notebook. "They will if you use the quantum processing array that you designed," Elena said, pulling Angela away from the viewport. "Besides, I have something to show you." Elena led Angela through the ship's corridors to her personal quarters, where she had transformed the small space into something magical. Floating candles, safely enclosed in glass, provided soft light, while Earth music played softly from hidden speakers. The viewport showed Europa in all its icy glory, but Elena had covered it with a projection of the night sky, as seen from Angela's childhood home in Detroit. "Elena, what is this?" Elena reached into a pocket and pulled out a small box that had been carefully secured for zero gravity. When she opened it, Angela gasped. Inside was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. Not traditional jewelry, but a small sculpture of intertwining mathematical equations rendered in platinum and gold. "Angela Buck," Elena said, her voice soft but steady. "You taught me that the most beautiful thing in the universe isn't a sunset or a flower, or even Jupiter's great red spot. It's the mathematics that makes all of those things possible. It's the patterns that connect everything to everything else." Angela felt tears forming in her eyes, something that was complicated in zero gravity. 5 years ago, you changed the world by refusing to let anyone diminish your light. But you changed me by showing me what it means to love someone's mind as much as their heart. Elena took Angela's hand. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life learning from your brilliance and supporting your dreams?" Angela had solved equations that had stumped entire teams of NASA's best mathematicians. She had revolutionized space travel and inspired a generation of young scientists. But in this moment, floating in the darkness between worlds, she found herself speechless. "Yes," she finally whispered, then louder. "Yes, Elena. 1,000 times yes." As Elena slipped the ring onto Angela's finger, Angela realized that this moment represented the completion of a different kind of equation, one that had nothing to do with orbital mechanics or fuel consumption, but everything to do with finding someone who saw her exactly as she was and loved her for it. The proposal, broadcast live to Earth as part of the mission's educational programming, became an instant global sensation. Within hours, #AngelaandElena was trending worldwide, and congratulations poured in from heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and millions of young people who saw in their love story a reflection of their own possibilities. But the message that touched Angela most came from an unexpected source. Dr. Buck, my name is Maria Santosjan, and you might remember me as the 12-year-old who wrote to you about water distribution systems 5 years ago. I'm now 17 and starting my freshman year at MIT in your former department. I wanted you to know that your engagement to Dr. Vasquez means everything to young LGBTQ+ scientists like me. You've shown us that we can reach for the stars and find love among them. Also, I solved the water distribution problem. My solution is being implemented in 12 countries now, and I used your ecological mathematics principles to do it. Thank you for showing me the way. P.S. I'm working on a new problem now: sustainable agriculture on Mars. I think you'll find my approach interesting when you get back to Earth. With love and admiration, Dr. Maria Santosjan. Yes, I graduated early too. Angela wiped away tears as she finished reading, her heart full of pride for the young woman who had followed the path Angela had helped create. As the Endeavour continued its mission around Jupiter, Angela and her team made discovery after discovery. They found evidence of life in Europa's subsurface oceans, identified mineral resources that could support future colonization efforts, and developed new mathematical models that would make interstellar travel theoretically possible within the next century. But perhaps more importantly, every day brought messages from Earth about the continuing impact of Angela's story. The Angela Buck Initiative for Mathematical Innovation had now supported over 10,000 young mathematicians from underrepresented communities. Universities worldwide had adopted her ecological mathematics principles. Most significantly, the percentage of women and minorities in STEM fields had reached historic highs. Professor Whitman, still serving his sentence in federal prison, had become a cautionary tale studied in ethics courses. His name was now associated with academic corruption and the dangers of allowing prejudice to override scientific integrity. Meanwhile, Angela's name graced libraries, scholarships, and research centers around the world. 3 years later, as the Endeavour began its journey back to Earth, Angela sat in the same observation deck where Elena had proposed, now planning their wedding ceremony and their next chapter together. Elena floated beside her, working on her own research while occasionally reaching over to squeeze Angela's hand. "Have you decided what you want to do when we get back?" Elena asked. Angela looked up from her calculations. "NASA has offered me the position of Director of Interplanetary Exploration. I'd be overseeing the next generation of deep space missions." "That's incredible. Are you going to accept?" Angela was quiet for a moment, watching Jupiter shrink in the distance as they headed home to Earth. "I'm thinking about it, but there's something else I want to do first." "What's that?" Angela pulled up a message on her tablet, one of thousands she'd received from young people around the world. This one was from a 14-year-old boy in rural Bangladesh who had taught himself advanced calculus using videos of Angela's lectures. "I want to spend a year visiting schools around the world. I want to look into the eyes of kids who think their dreams are too big and tell them that the universe is waiting for their contributions. I want to make sure that no one ever again has to hear that their kind doesn't belong in mathematics." Elena smiled and pulled Angela closer. "And after that?" "After that, we're going to Mars. Together. NASA is planning a permanent research station, and they want us to design the mathematical frameworks for the first human colony on another planet. Just the two of us against the red planet." Angela laughed, the sound echoing through the observation deck. "Not just us. We'll be bringing along the next generation, all those young mathematicians who grew up knowing that their dreams are valid and their minds are valued." As Earth grew larger in the viewport, Angela reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the scared teenager who had stood at a blackboard, faced with a professor's racism and the weight of impossible mathematics. That girl could never have imagined that her defiance would lead to revolutionary discoveries, global recognition, the love of an incredible woman, and the chance to literally reach for the stars. But perhaps most importantly, that girl could never have imagined the millions of young people around the world who now looked up at the night sky and saw not distant, impossible dreams, but destinations that were waiting for them. Angela's phone chimed with one final message, this one from Dr. Stern, now retired but still following Angela's career with pride. Angela, as I watch your return to Earth, I keep thinking about that day in my office 5 years ago when you stood up to Harold Whitman. You asked me then what happens to people who refuse to be silenced. Now I know the answer. They change the world. Welcome home, Dr. Buck. The future is waiting for your next equation. As the Endeavour entered Earth's atmosphere, Angela Buck, mathematician, astronaut, revolutionary, and bride-to-be, looked out at the world that had once tried to limit her potential and now celebrated her achievements. She had proven that love could triumph over hate, that excellence could emerge from anywhere, and that the stars belonged to anyone brave enough to reach for them. Professor Whitman had been wrong about everything, but especially about this. Her kind didn't just do math. Her kind was redefining what mathematics could be, what humanity could achieve, and what love could look like when it was built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the infinite possibilities of the universe itself. The girl who had once been told that her kind doesn't do math was coming home as the woman who had taught the world that every kind does everything. And that love, in all its forms, was the most beautiful equation of all.